Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you by Shared Services Link and in association with Consider Solutions. Today, we're going to be looking at global business services and digital transformation. Where are we going and what does next actually look like? My name is Susie West. I'm the founder and CEO at Shared Services Link. I'm your host for today. I'm very pleased to be presenting to veterans in this space, to experts, Dan French, who is the founder and CEO at Consider Solutions, and Jim O'Connor, who is Global Finance and GBS Advisory Practice Leader at the Hackett Group. So great to be having these two giants of the industry on the line today. I'm going to hand over to Dan, who's going to be talking you through the agenda and the context. So with no further ado, over to you, please, Dan.
Thanks very much, Susie, and welcome, Jim. Yeah, so we're talking about global business services and digital transformation. We're going to be talking about some pretty key topics now. I want to talk a little bit about the shift to digital and what it means. There's a lot of talk about digital native companies and what digital transformation is all about, and I want to add a little bit of an additional perspective to that. Jim's going to share with us a Hackett Group State of the Nation, and then Jim and I are going to share the discussion around the digital advantage on RPA and intelligent automation, broader trends for the future. What tips do we have for navigating the waters for the future of GBS? So just to introduce a bit of context, many of you know Consider Solutions, but for those of you who don't, this is a context in which we approach these problems from. We are striving for this aspirational goal of world-class finance, which is fairly consistent with what Hackett Group described. We're focusing on driving better business results, reducing the cost of finance, optimizing cash flow, and having better risk management. And the temple on the right shows some key pillars. And the key thing we're talking about here today is process transformation and optimization and the role of technology and data in doing that. And there's some other pillars to do with financial control and compliance and risk management, which are not so important today. We get our influences from some pretty significant brands around the world. We work with these organizations, and we're very fortunate they influence our thinking, and hopefully we influence their practices. So you'll get a sense a little bit in some of my examples and case studies from some of these organizations. So let's start by thinking about this whole issue of digital transformation. There's a lot of talk about the role of the digitally native company, and you can't have a discussion around digital without the classic behemoths of Uber or Amazon, who are classic digital companies in many respects. And you look at Airbnb, for example, and Airbnb has grown massively in a very short period of time. But the interesting thing about Uber and Airbnb is basically they're both dating agencies. They don't really own anything. They have massive revenues and valuation purely on their ability to connect with consumers and provide a very convenient experience. And this is something I want to kind of think about as we talk about what digital transformation really means for organizations. So everyone talks about Apple. And Netflix is an interesting company. I've just noticed today they had 36% revenue growth in the last quarter. But the interesting thing about Netflix is, as an economic customer, which I am of theirs, they don't pay me much attention. But there are 5 users of the Netflix service in my house, 2 adults and 3 kids, and they know in great detail the behavior of each of those consumers. And they're far more interested in the consumer dynamics than they are in the economic customer, which in my opinion is something for us all to think about. Who it is that we're actually serving, irrespective of who's paying. So they know exactly what the 18-year-old's watching, which probably is best for them to know and me not to. They know what the 10-year-old's watching, and they also make suggestions accordingly. So it's kind of an interesting idea there about consumer intimacy rather than customer intimacy. And Tesla, obviously, we know about that business. I think what's interesting there is a friend of mine who perhaps had more money than sense went in to buy a Tesla. He went into the very glossy showroom, had a look around and just went straight to an assistant there and said, I want to buy one. I want to buy the Roadster. And they said, oh, okay. Well, you have to go home and do it on the web. But he says, I don't want to. I just want to buy it now. So there was a little bit of a discussion. I said, well, we don't actually take orders here, but we can help you through the web experience. So we did it there, sat down there. And what he realized is he configured his own car and he had something very unique to him. And of course, he might have had an 18-month waiting time, but there was a very personalized experience, even if there was some confusion about how to deal with the consumer at that point of physical sale. And look at a company like Starbucks, who are no young company anymore. They regard themselves as the biggest startup, $20 billion of coffee. And you think, well, what's digital about that? Well, nowadays, you can get on a train on your commute, and on your phone, you can say, I want a double espresso and I want a granola bar, and you can pick it up at the station without getting in a line, pick it up and walk on to work. Now, the interesting thing about that is, even if Starbucks coffee isn't your favorite coffee, the convenience of being able to do that on your commute is really powerful, and it's making a massive impact. Then in Europe, or specifically in the UK, there's a business called Ocado, which is essentially a retail grocery business, like a grocery store, which delivers to your door. The interesting thing there is you go online, you choose what you want, and it's very, very convenient, and they'll deliver it whatever time of day or night you want it delivered, with whatever repetition you want. But this is breaking down the brand relationships we've always had to our favorite supermarkets. Because now Ocado say to you, here's your favorite breakfast cereal. Do you want me to get it at the best price? And it might not come from your usual supermarket. So the supermarkets are starting to worry about that, because this is a highly consumer intimate and highly convenient model. In the Netherlands, similar business in Picnic, they do the same stuff, but they've even taken it a step further. I don't know about you, but with e-commerce and online buying, particularly young people will buy 20 items of clothing, get them delivered, try them all on, and find the one that they like and send the other 19 back. Now, of course, somebody's got to take the boxes back or get them posted. Picnic, in addition to delivering your groceries, will take all those boxes back and get them posted for you. Another element of convenience, just take the pain away from the consumer. So, and in London, there's a taxi firm called Addison Lee that's picked up some of the ideas of Uber and transformed themselves from a traditional car hire firm, taxi firm, to be an online app delivered firm. And you can actually do things on that you can't do in Uber, like you can pre-book cars at the airport, or you can get stuff for 3 days away. And just finally, in this talk about digital natives, just to be clear that it's not all about technology. Spoke is a new business that deals with the challenge a lot of guys have in getting clothes that fit. Unless you're a particular very slim size, it's quite difficult to get trousers and jackets that fit, and it frustrates the hell out of me. Anyway, Spoke has come along. It's available in the UK and US now. And the first thing they do is when they get hold of you as a customer, they'll say, what sizes are you, waist, legs, and also what build. So they've got a build of A, B, or C. And of course, if you saw my initial photograph, you won't be surprised to see that I'm a D. But what's great about that is they say, try a few sizes. We'll send you a few pairs of trousers. You find the one you like, and then we will lock that in as your style and size. And after that, all the different types of trousers they have, or jacket, you just order them online, they turn up. Now, they're all handmade, so the business itself isn't particularly digital, but the consumer interaction and the convenience is highly digital. The reason for all of these examples is just to get us to think about the fact that digital transformation isn't about technology, it's about consumer intimacy, the rise of the new consumer, and it's about convenience. And I think pretty much every business is starting to identify with that and realize that's where the future is. And we've got to all start changing our way of thinking. So here's a way of summarizing what I've just discussed. A lot of disruption, but it's enabled by technology, enabled by data, but also enabled by this consumer awakening and convenience and intimacy, and the fact that B2B businesses are moving to become business to consumer businesses. I'll use a couple of other examples. BMW, throughout my adult life, has been known as the ultimate driving machine. Their current vision, which is radically different, is about autonomous, electric, shareable transportation. So right now, they serve customers through worldwide dealerships, and their customer is a dealership, and the dealership has a relationship with you, the consumer. In the new model, they're going to have to get very deeply intimate with us as consumers and potential consumers. And we may never buy one of their assets. We may only rent services as we do on Uber. So they're changing their business upside down to deal with this. Many other organizations, even consumer goods companies, are doing this. People that make toothpaste and sell it through retail supermarkets are realizing, because brand loyalty is breaking down, they've got to get close to the consumer. So I just encourage you to think, irrespective of digital, in your business, how could the business model change to be more intimate with the consumer rather than just the economic buyer? That's kind of an introduction. And of course, technology is transforming our core processes within GBS, within shared services and beyond, whether it's purchase to pay, order to cash, or record to report. There's lots of stuff going on. We've got web-based portals. We've got integrated suites for the end-to-end process. We've got analytics. We've got robotic process automation and integration tools that allow us to break down the barriers, the human barriers in some of those cycles. And that's pretty important. But most of our effort is still internally within the process. I'm not really thinking beyond to the customer and the ultimate consumer. So I want to think about processes now. In the 1980s, there was something called just-in-time manufacturing, which became very popular. And in the 90s was really perfected by Dell, where they had the make to order. So you put your order in for a Dell computer and they'd manufacture them after you'd ordered them. But this has really reached a whole new level. And I want you to think about this with regard to any business, including your own business. Probably won't be relevant right now, but think about how it might operate in the future. Now, this example is based on Uber, but it could be many businesses. So you'll see this cycle here. So the first thing Uber do is they acquire the service providers, the people with cars, the drivers who want to drive around. So they acquire those, and then at some point they acquire us as a customer. And in terms of their process cycle, they locate a customer through your app. They propose a service based on where you want to go. They select the service provider from their available ones. And the interesting bit happens at the point at which they commit the service provider. And they commit the service provider before they commit us, the customer, which is a very unusual back-to-front way of operating compared to normal models. Service providers committed, then they commit us, the customer, and they charge us immediately. Now, the interesting thing about that is anybody here, if you took a look at an accounts receivable point of view, if you've got a DSO of 32 days or 34 days, you're doing pretty well. Uber have got a DSO of 0 because they are getting the money at the point the customer is committing, which is amazing. The next step is they pay the service provider. They pay the service provider between 20 and 25% of the cost of the ride, but they pay them up to 7 days late in an aggregated payment. Now, the person with the car, who's the Uber driver, thinks that's great because most big businesses don't pay you in 7 days. They pay you in 30 days or 45 days. So they're happy. But if you look at the impact on their cash flow and working capital and the nature of their business, they've got a complete float of up to 7 days and a DSO of 0. That's absolutely amazing. Now, obviously, that really smart payment piece this is obviously for direct procurement within the cycle. But what's interesting is there's a new kind of process here, which is an integrated process. This isn't an order to cash process. It isn't a purchase to pay process. It's an integrated, combined approach. So we need to start thinking about that, because if we're going to get consumer convenient and we're going to get intimate, we've got to bear that in mind. So I just want to leave that with you and think about how that might affect your business now or in the future. In my opinion, there are very few businesses where that is never going to affect us. So Gartner Group have done a great job of recognizing that our classic changes in terms of making change happen in business was always about people, process, and technology. And they put data right in the middle of that. So when we talk about digital, we're not just talking about technology, we're talking about data and we're talking about process. And in the context of that Uber example I've just shown, the data is associated with connection to the consumer, location of them, knowledge of what they want, committing the transaction, and doing funds transfer, all in a digital cycle. So that's a pretty interesting way of thinking about processes. Now that leads us to what implications does that have for us in GBS or shared services or processes supporting the business. So Jim is going to give us a few words now on the state of the nation on GBS. So, Jim?
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. I think Dan did a great job of outlining the advent of digital. I know when I saw him speak before, I immediately connected. I think we need to broaden our thinking. And we thought it would be good before we talk about, as Dan will in the next section, of how digital is impacting, particularly around RPA and AI. We thought it'd be a good idea to just, let's set the stage for what does GBS, what does shared services look right now? At Hackett, we call it GBS, Global Business Services. You could call it shared services. The important point is the mindset. So I'll set the stage and then we'll pivot back. Just some staging. What you see on your screen is a visual depicting maturity. I think a lot of us have seen this. People are at different levels, and we think your goal should be to move up. We've built this empirically at Hackett. As many of you know, we have benchmarks. We've been studying GBS for 16 years in a row. We've done this study. So let me just highlight a few points. We could spend an hour on this slide. Give me 2 minutes. One thing is just the fact that we've been studying this. This has been around a while. So if you're in a shared service, there are proven concepts today that are being upended with digital, but still valid, and I'm going to hit some of those. The other is the higher the maturity, the more value we see organizations reap. And perhaps I best explain this by sharing a few characteristics. If you think about what are some of the key differentiators between 1, 2, and 3? Well, in 1, it's typically a single function. Maybe it's HR, payroll, maybe it's finance, core operations, A2R, P2P. Stage 2 is where we start bringing functions together. and extending end to end. So maybe it's not just AP, maybe it's purchase to pay. And maybe it's not just finance, it's finance, HR, and IT. And we begin to operate as a group. And stage 3 is we're really synchronizing as a service, not so much a function or a process. And the value changes, as you could imagine. Initially in stage 1, it's typically about cost, and it's about labor arbitrage. And once you start to get that cost down at a minimum service level, you immediately start wanting to amp up your service levels, improve your cycle times, your quality, your customer experience, which gets you into stage 2. And stage 3, you start adding real value in terms of agility, your ability to pivot with the business, your ability to take on other processes that are atypical, your ability to drive value through analytics. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense. It's hard to get there, and it evolves. If you just look at those numbers, last year was 39% in stage 2, but only 7% the year before. So let me share what that looks like if you're at the top. Why should you care? And as I mentioned, these are empirical data. I've got a client, Jeff, who's steered at shared services, and his point with these is these should at least raise our eyebrow and make you want to be a part of what that could look like. What it looks like is those that outperform significantly outperform, particularly in areas that are less typical, like agility, like customer intimacy. Cost, you can see they outperform as well. However, even peers do pretty good. On the right-hand side is what I really like to emphasize, which is this isn't a one-time thing. If you're world class today, you may not be 3 years from now. So people continue to improve, both pure and world class, across the core elements of what they're pursuing, and productivity, cost, service improvement, and quality. So if that's compelling enough, then the question may be, well, why am I doing this? And it's really interesting how that's evolved over time. Part of it is people have moved up the maturity curve, but let me frame up this data for you. On the left, you'll see the importance ranking. So we ask our clients to say, what's your most important strategic objective? Why have you chosen to bundle your functions or parts of your functions into a business services company? And, 10 years ago, that was cost, number one, no doubt about it. Today, it's not. It's strategic alignment. It's service excellence. It's customer intimacy. And, oh, yeah, I expect cost reductions, too. So that's interesting. The other point is, those that start to do it well really start to get at some of those strategic things. You can see a significant performance difference in agility, service focus, and customer intimacy. So if that's where we are today and some of the key stats, I just want to hit about 3 characteristics of those that are world-class. How do you get there? And it starts with scope. You have to have scale. You have to have scope. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that the evidence is those that are doing it well are providing multiple services, not just finance, not just HR, but you can see a number of these. The other thing I would say, haven't seen these reports year over year, that's interesting, that little gray bar that hits 2 to 3 years, where will you be? There's some optimism out there. People are planning on expanding. And then just for your interest, I know a lot of people probably have a finance background. For the finance organization, what does that penetration look like? And as you can see, operationally, as Dan alluded to as well, that's where a lot of that stuff sits now, is in shared services organizations. So if scope is one of the best practices, what about enterprise reach? So let's talk about that characteristic. So if you have finance and scope, if you have AP and scope, if you're really advanced and you've done some reporting, then the question is, to what degree have you penetrated across the enterprise? Many of you are part of complex organizations. You've got multiple business units. We have multiple geographic regions. And it's not easy delivering globally and across distinct and unique business units. And what we found is those that are world-class do it better, but there's actually room to improve in general. But certainly those that are pure only half fully extend across the enterprise. And world-classes are significantly more deployed and a lot less likely to just be a single shingle where it's a shared services only in one business unit, geography, or function. So that's another key characteristic we see of successful organizations. So if you think about reach and scope, how do you get there? At Hackett, we think one of the best ways to get there is to start thinking of yourself as a professional organization and deploy what we call service management. And service management, just to frame it, and I'm not going to read every characteristic you see on the right-hand side. We've been playing around with this for about 10 years or so, and we just came up with a service management 2.0. But what you can see here is, in order to effectively operate as an organization, you have to know what your strategy is. You've got to have overt design. You have to know how you transition services from business units or acquisitions into the center, and then operationally you have to be competent. And you need to treat this organization with a bit of a commercial mindset and establish the resources and the processes of service management to put that in place. We think it's probably one of the most critical levers. The gentleman I mentioned earlier, Jeff, in the 3 centers I've seen him build, this is critical number 1 that he uses to execute. So in our mind, service management is a key special sauce today and tomorrow. Just to highlight a couple of those other stats, I think you can see the importance of those, particularly the distinguishing characteristics of world-class organizations. So if it's a key special sauce today and tomorrow, our thought is tomorrow the impact of digital will be even more important, which is where we want to share the balance of our conversation. But before we hand it back and we start talking about that, Dan and I were thinking about what's compelling. And I think what's compelling with this stat is every year we do what we call a key issues survey. And we ask people all kinds of questions. But one of the questions we've been asking for about the last 4 years is, what do you think the impact of digital will be on how you operate your organization? Be it a shared services, be it HR, be it finance, procurement. Almost unanimously, people said, wow, it's absolutely going to impact it. But what's interesting and what we hope you start to think about during this webinar and after is, what are you going to do about that? Only half of the people have a strategy. I mean, that's a crime. And only 4 in 10 have really thought about how they're going to have the resources and competencies to compete in the future. So we think that those are some compelling things to think about as you start to apply digital to your organization. So let's hand it to Dan and talk about what do we think some of that digital advantage might be.
Thanks very much, Jim. That was really sharp and on point. I particularly like that last insight. I mean, the fact that every leader believes digital transformation is fundamental, but only half of them have got a plan, and less than that have the wherewithal to achieve the plan. That raises some interesting questions. I mean, maybe it's because the issue about the consumer, the convenience, and the business model are yet to be resolved. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the digital advantage, the technology piece. There's an awful lot made of the technologies in the space, and they're important. But as we hopefully are making clear, they're just one part of the toolkit. So we're going to talk about RPA and intelligent automation. Here's a survey from HFS Research at the turn of the year. And basically, it's a litany of the technology buzzwords, frankly, RPA, cloud, IoT, and all the rest of it. And definitely sees robotic process automation as the number 1 investment focus of those technologies, which may well certainly be true. I think I've got a few questions about whether or not in reality, as an organizational level, 50% believe that this is one of the most significant things that are going to drive the operational improvements. But this gives you a sense of how much focus and effort is going into this marketplace, and it is a marketplace. So let's look at the reality and the buzz and the reality of robotic process automation. And if anybody on this webcast is not quite clear about robotic process automation, because it's a confusing term, the robotic piece is very fluffy, and it's the description at the bottom is pretty clear. We're talking about pieces of software. We used to call this application integration. There's nothing wrong with having a nice class of software, RPA, to create interest and attention in getting things done. But the things I like to really look at is the realities. And Steve Gordon of Becton Dickinson had a great quote. He was one of the early trailblazers in this space. And he said, RPA is about fixing the potholes in the road. Do not confuse it with building the new highway. And I think that's a really powerful concept, certainly worth thinking about. And Sanjay at Genpact, don't trade the entire toolbox for one screwdriver. And I think that's kind of the essence of what we're learning through the experiences of the past few years in the best and worst of what's been achieved. So talking a little bit about RPA, and it is a powerful technology, but we've got to look at it in context. So here's a slightly more sober assessment, and this is a Hackett Group, again, recent survey, and this reflects more of what we actually see in reality. So in finance, mainstream adoption in about 3% of organizations. in GBS in 10% of organizations. And maybe 2 to 3, maybe 4 or 5 years, these achievements on the right-hand side will be met. But so if you're feeling left out and you're not there yet, don't feel too bad about it, because it's like a lot of things. Everyone's talking about it. Not many people are doing it, but very few are doing it very well. However, the people doing it very well are now showing the road for the rest of us. So that's kind of good news in terms of looking at the target areas and looking at the fact that the early adopters have certainly done their work, and now the technology is ready for mainstream adoption, which is great. So let's just talk a little bit about RPA and what it's there for. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on this, because in terms of RPA and the software bots that are produced, I think nobody would argue with these advantages. So, massive percentage efficiency gains, cheaper and faster than the alternatives. These bots don't get bored, tired, or lose concentration. They can work 24 hours a day. All of this is good stuff. I think the most interesting and relevant piece of all this is, in today's world where millennials are coming into the workplace and being a lot more selective about what they want to do than perhaps we were when we first started out, making the workplace more appealing to hire into and getting rid of frustrating tasks that nobody wants to do is actually a pretty powerful agenda. Because if you don't have this and you've got bringing young people in and they just don't want to do the work, you've got a problem. And we might be surprised, but that does seem to be happening more and more. So I think that's a powerful thing. So this is all good, and we'll support all of that. I think the more interesting element is to learn from experience. What do we learn how to do better than the people who've been before us? And I think one big thing here is there's a lot made of these enormous productivity increases. And the thing to remember is these productivity increases are based on task level activities, not on processes. In fact, one big RPA case study talked about the fact that if they had the time again when they gave their business case to executives, they would have called it robotic task automation, not robotic process automation, because it gave a false view of what was being achieved. The point about it is, in a small task, a massive productivity increase may not scale to the end-to-end process. And when you tell executives you've got a 400% productivity increase, they might be expecting something very different to what you're actually delivering. The issue of control, oversight, and governance is a big issue, and organizations that are well down the road here are putting in place governance models and organizations to make sure that the RPA developed bots operating as expected. The development process itself needs governance, control, and process. A lot of the early developments have been very popular with IT folks because in the early days, it bypassed all the strictures of development policies. And of course, now everyone's realizing that those policies are there for a reason, whether it's security and control, all the rest of it. Obviously, these are rules-based pieces of software, like all pieces of software have been. So if those rules are not well designed and monitored and well designed and implemented, these bots that will run at scale will repeat errors at scale, which relates to the point made by Walmart down the bottom there, which I think is a great quote, is if you've got a bad process or a bad set of tasks, automation will make bad worse faster. I think that's very powerful. So you've got to be clear that you have detailed task level standard operating instructions. Otherwise, you're in a dangerous area. Got to think about the moving parts and points of failure. So the systems you're connecting with RPA, those are going to change over time. It's important to have an approach to deal with that, but more importantly, to have visibility of those changes. Because often, due to organizational barriers, people aren't aware when the ERP is being updated or whatever. So that's a big issue. And I think there's a lot of talk, again, a lot of marketing hype about RPA and AI, sort of the blurring of the two. It's quite important to recognize RPA is rules-based automation, which is powerful and we need. And it's not AI, because as we'll talk a little bit about AI in a minute, you don't really want black box decisions deciding on how you're recognizing your revenue, for example, when you know what the rules are. You don't want black box decisions about how you're committing expenditure. So AI's got a role. It's not the same as RPA, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The piece at the bottom there, 38% of RPA implementations fail to achieve expected benefits. But a lot of that comes back to the first point. If you're not clear in what you're actually going to achieve and what the outcome we're looking for is, then without doubt be a failure. I think these bullets, this list here has increased somewhat over the past year or so, but I definitely regard this as definitely a tick list to be aware of in your own work. However far you are down the process, take account of these because they'll help you. We talked about RPA and we talked about who introduced AI. So AI has got a whole bunch of different strands, and we're not going to go into them in great detail at this point, but AI has been around for 40, 50 years, and it's pretty well developed as a discipline of science. And with the advent of greater technology processing power, a lot of these things are now reality. The most topical form of AI, which is all over the press, is machine learning, and because that's behind the autonomous car, it's behind Siri and Alexa, it's behind machines beating experts, the world champions at various complex board games. So machine learning has got the press coverage, if you like, but it's also a powerful approach. And the key thing about machine learning, as we talked before, that conventional software, including RPA, has always been about rules-based. You have to know what good looks like. You have to be able to define the process based on rules. Machine learning takes a different approach. It says, if I've got enough data, a large enough body of data, I can learn from observing the data as to what good looks like and what bad or unusual looks like. And that's the essence of machine learning. So avoiding rules-based structures and focusing on the statistical performance of data, certainly at very large volumes, which is one of the challenges with it. You need to have enough volume of data to make it work. So let's talk about a real example. So machine learning in the real world, there's been a lot of great applications, and here's a great example in the diagnosis of cancer. So if you have any suspicion of cancer, you get a blood test, and that blood test gets, that droplet of that blood gets put on a slide, put under a high magnification microscope, and an expert pathologist will examine it to see if they can find the cancer cells. And that is obviously an expert process, and it's time consuming and has limited resources. And obviously it's life and death. So anything we can do to improve that has got to be good news. So smart people decided, let's build an AI classifier, which is a machine learning algorithm, to work out, to learn from millions of samples of photographs of blood cells to work out what's right. And this AI classifier found 92.5% of cancer cases, which is amazing. So that was great news and was much applause. But what they found was that the human pathologist was better, 96.5%. Now, in something that's life or death, you want to have the human pathologist because you want the best chance of survival. But it turns out, and this is the big deal, if you like, is that AI supporting the human expert is even better. So by having this algorithm supporting the human expert, they hit 99.5% success rate. That is amazing for lots of reasons. One is it increases cancer survival rates. It also means that the expert human can work faster, but it doesn't put the expert human out of a job. So when we talk about professional work, this is the model that we're starting to realize is the future of professional work. It's supporting expert humans and making decisions better. It turns out that humans are better at identifying false positives, and the AI was better at identifying those hard to identify edge cases. So this is a really important part of thinking about how AI might support us in business. So if you think about the balancing act in our business processes and supporting GBS, we've got two things going on. We've got the efficiency drive in task automation using ERP, using end-to-end process suites, using RPA, for example. And we've got effectiveness about process optimization. It's about decision making. And how do we support experts in the best way using AI? So that is a kind of interesting way of looking at the balance. And this is a yin and yang, as I like to think of it, as of efficiency and effectiveness. So where does this lead us? So my co-founder is a very smart guy. He's a Stanford professor, and he's been a leader in semantic web and AI for some time. And he's been pushing me for quite a while to say, you've got to start thinking about these new ways of operating because they change the whole paradigm of how we solve problems. So he convinced me to invest in some research. So we've invested in this research for 2 or 3 years now. And what we've taken it to look at, how does machine learning specifically help us in enterprise business process problem? So we looked at purchase to pay and its larger cousin source to pay, about can we get enough data to be able to test these concepts out? So we have, if you look at this end-to-end source to pay, for many of you in shared services, you might actually be running invoice to pay, so you might really be down in the settlement area on the right-hand side. Purchase to pay, you might be starting ordering through goods receipting and settlement. And if you're source to pay, you might be far up on the left-hand side. The reason we want to look at the whole process is if we're going to look at data, we know that most of the issues caused in invoice to pay, for example, in accounts payable, most of the issues are caused way further up the chain outside of the scope of the role of accounts payable. So we thought, let's get a view right down this process, right up to the source of it. And by looking at large bodies of data, so we're talking about tens of millions of vendors, hundreds of millions of invoices and POs and all the rest of it, getting an interesting insight in what machine learning can tell us. So what we've done, what the team's done is put together a way of analyzing data kind of in near real time, looking at automating KPIs from data in systems, so taking it out and producing data and presenting it through a web interface. So you'll see some stats here, and you'll see, for example, the average number of invoices processed per FTE looks a little low, so that might be a point to look at. And paid on time invoices, again, a little bit low, to say the least. So it allows us to focus immediately on the current performance, not just the performance of 3 months ago or even last month, the performance right now. And then looking, KPIs alone don't really help us solve any problems. So how do we look into what's really going on in the process? So here, drilling down into data, current data on the processes. So if, for example, and these are just some examples, if, for example, your process is that you use a purchase requisition to set yourself up for a purchase order, if that's your policy, then 25% of POs without a PR is a problem. So we can drill into those and find out what the cause is and fix the root cause. And then, POs created on or after the invoice date, we all know that problem. And again, let's get to the root of what that is and look at the detail, but not in a historical view, but in a here and now view. So how do we show then the things that really need to be dealt now? How do we prioritize? And obviously, duplicate invoices and duplicate payments are still a very critical issue. You'd think in this day and age we'd have solved that problem, but we haven't. If anything, it's happening more often than before, partly due to business email compromise, a lot of kind of scam invoices coming through, but also the sheer amount of change coming in on the organization. We've seen a lot of duplicate invoices, and this machine learning approach is identifying duplicate invoices that come from vendors that look very different, but they might be related entities. So we've had some interesting experiences here. So again, you can dig down into these, you can block those invoices, but more importantly, you can address the root causes. And duplicate payments is obviously something, as we start applying this more deeply, this is going to tend to zero because we're going to catch them much earlier than that. And then processing errors is an interesting point. So this, in the case of invoices, this is invoices that are blocked, cancelled, put on hold. And what's interesting, we found 0.5% isn't a very significant percentage, but 10,000 invoices for people to manually block and analyze and diagnose and work out what's going on is a massive amount of effort to put in. And what we're seeing is with the advent of RPA, this number is going up. And the reason, it turns out, is related to that issue of not being precise enough about the rules. So quite often we're seeing a lot of invoices and POs being created or populated into an ERP through an RPA or other interface automation. And the rules not being sufficiently precise such that they're having to be blocked because they're slightly incorrect. So here's another great opportunity to identify, if you like, do a health check on your interface and RPA activities and stop those things happening in the first place. And then obviously look at process cycle variations, sort of the total cycle, the outliers at both ends, and a very short cycle of purchase order to pay and a very long cycle. Both of those are interesting for lots of different reasons. And then in terms of working capital, we know that in Fortune 500 companies today, as of a couple of months ago, the average time to pay invoices was now 57 days. But most big businesses have payment terms of no less than 30 and quite often 45 or 60. And you see here by looking at these invoices coming through with payment terms that are shorter, highlighting those and validating whether or not they match what we've contracted to or whether somehow we're just picking up what the supplier wants. So again, a massive impact on working capital just by getting smart insights on data and drilling down into the detail. So what we're trying to do in all of this is use machine learning with large bodies of data, look across the organization, look transversely across the processes, the data sources and all the rest of it, and apply some smarts to work out how do we work out what's really going on and how to improve the process radically and support the efficiency drive with an effectiveness drive. So if you think about this as an analytics cycle or a mining cycle, classically, if we do that even today, it's a big process and it's daunting. So there's a planning activity, there's business requirements, you need to sit around whiteboards, smart people, you've got to have IT involved, you've got to configure some software, you've got to check for false positives, you've got to go around that cycle several times. And most people say even today, this is a 6 to 9 month cycle per process or per insight you're trying to get. And frankly, that's just not ready for the digital world. So we said, that's not going to be helpful. What we need is some way of applying this Uberization idea, practical insight where we can connect and go and get the nuggets of gold without all the unpleasantness. So get the data, the insights and action without all that process going on. So, yeah, that's what we've been doing in terms of as a case study. And we've got a whole bunch of companies involved in that now. If anybody on this webcast wants to participate in this, it is free of charge right now to just participate in getting an assessment on your own P2P cycle. You've got my email details at the end of this. So let's think then about where that leads us in the underlying trends. We've talked about this. It's about the consumer. Look beyond the silos. It's about end-to-end processes, and data is key. Those key trends are what we're seeing for the next phase, and the technologies on both sides are pretty key. Jim, you got a few comments on digital transformation and how it's going to redefine these functions?
Sure. First of all, thank you. I think that was a great illustration, and I think the purpose of this slide is really to reinforce that, right? We are doing things that we haven't done before, and we have to think about how to do them differently. We need to orient to how people consume, and we need to change our processes. So at Hackett, when we think about finance, HR, procurement, where are they going? It's different. I mean, I think your example shows how we could redefine how we think about a process. You know, if you think about even like an HR or a procurement, I mean, procurement's putting handhelds, smartphones, tablets, any connected device into suppliers' hands to work with those consumers.
And you've got your 10 levers of that drive into world class.
And you know, when we think about where are we going from here, hopefully you got the digital message, right? It is absolutely critical. But we think it's not necessarily an either or, but an and equation. So there are still proven philosophies, proven practices like going end to end, global process ownership, like thinking through your process leverage and placement that I talked a little bit about, like orienting directly to your customers and rethinking how you're going to do that. Others that we've talked about, but at the end of the day, digital is an enabler, but we see really, and we work with people every day around these 10 levers largely to advance their organization.
And those are great ways that you as Hackett Group can help an organization get a sense of where you are now and where you need to go. So I really like that. All of this means we need end-to-end process thinking. We know we need it. We've got to start taking action. We can't have multiple different priorities and different outcomes foisted on the same process. So I think hopefully that is self-evident. End-to-end process thinking.
And it can be thought of as soft, and it's not. And I've been challenged by multiple clients, a controller, Dwayne in particular, I can think of. Everybody agrees with it, but it felt it's soft. So I've made a purpose of analyzing that at Hackett, and I think you can see that there are significant benefits. Most surprisingly, just the quality of data, and if you think about how to add value, how important that is, but also the cost of a function.
And that really supports the research I was just sharing as well. That's a really good point. And of course, there's some data points there in the finance process. We talked about consumer and the change of the process. If the consumer's king, things start to change. New KPIs, quality at all costs, and processes have to be simple, standard, and seamless. And again, Jim, you've got some comments on the seamless and simplification story.
The point here is when we're thinking digital, similar to it's an and equation, less is more. Simplification is key, and it's within our control to simplify. So we tend to think of what's self-inflicted versus what can't you change. And so ridding yourself of that complexity and simplifying is key in order to start to enable some of this kind of Apple easy mentality that we talked about.
And what's amazing about this is for every $1 billion in revenue you have, there's $10 million on the table between low complexity and high complexity in terms of saving. That's a really important story.
Significant. And this resonates well with our clients. It's something very actionable people can work on.
Yeah, that's great. So I've just got a few final comments. So we saw the dark picture at the beginning. Now, if we're going to wake up early in the morning, do a couple of downward dogs and have a mint tea before we start work at 11 in the morning, there's got to be some thoughts to help us get there. A couple of big things. We've got to manage the detail and the big picture. The big picture now includes the consumer, the impact on the consumer, convenience, and the business model, not just the internals of how our process connects with itself. Focus on critical business outcomes. We spend a lot of time worrying about headcount and how to reduce headcount and reduce cost. Here's a great example from BP. Started a source-to-pay process, thinking P2P efficiency was the answer. The big value was increased contracts compliance and reducing the costs of goods and services acquired. Much more significant than a few heads here and there. Does this mean we're moving to a driverless future with AI and smart technologies? Well, not in our lifetime, not certainly for professional roles. Be aware of this peak of inflated expectations with all of these technologies. Be aware that some of your business cases are going to be encouraged to go up there. Just be careful and aim for the plateau of productivity. Think about humanistic AI, which was a conversation I shared earlier. And final comment on peaking of the future, Jim, the 2025 operating model. What's it going to look like?
Navigating, as you navigate, we've hit digital, we've hit the state of the nation, we've given some tactical examples, but just illustratively, what might that look like? On the left-hand side, you see what kind of the proven model is today. You have a GBS, you have a few COEs, there's still a lot in the plants. We think the advent of digital is going to turn that on its head. And we're going to have less people in GBS, but more. And we're going to have a lot more focused COEs. And the people in the BU and finance are going to be liberated to focus on that customer service and the operations. And we've got a number of clients that are even bolder than this vision. I was just talking to a client the other day, and she wanted to automate 80% basically of their transactional items and really ramp up BU-focused COEs to provide that customer intimacy. So in some cases, this model you see here is probably not bold enough for some of our clients.
One final point is we always hope for instant gratification. We hope for the silver bullet. We always hope, we're always disappointed. There is no silver bullet. All of these technologies, all of this approach from the consumer, all of what Jim shared about GBS, we've got to make a lot of improvements, and we've got to do 100 small steps to get it right. And I think this is a really important observation. There is no single easy way. I think that's self-evident. This is what we've covered. I hope you found it useful.
We are going to have to leave it there. So Dan French, Jim O'Connell, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for your time and attention today as well. Everyone that attended, thank you and goodbye.